Welcome back, everyone. It's me again, Mr. Alviar, reading to you Chapter 6 tonight from Cabin on Trouble Creek by Jean Van Leeuwen. If you remember, last night we left off with Daniel marking another scratch on the log just beside the fireplace at the bottom. And he's up to 16 scratches now, marking about half of the time has passed until Pa comes back with the whole family this time. Let's begin. Chapter 6. Will finished his fishing spear. Feeling its sharp point, Daniel had no doubt that it would pierce right through any fish. "Now I'll catch us something for supper," said Will. Daniel watched as he waded knee-deep into the creek. He stood still, the spear poised in his hand, waiting. For a long time, Will didn't move. He just stared into the slowly moving water. And then Daniel saw his shoulder tense. And suddenly, his spear struck down. "Ah!" Will looked at Daniel in disappointment. "It got away." But he tried again. Daniel was surprised at how patient his brother could be, standing so still for so long until he spotted another fish. And once more his spear darted down, and once more Will scowled in frustration. "I'm not fast enough," he muttered. But he practiced, thrusting his spear into the water again and again. The clear water turned cloudy. Daniel thought he must have scared away all the fish by now. "Maybe you ought to try another spot," he suggested. So Will moved upstream to where the creek widened to form a roundish pool. "Most likely the big ones live here," he said, grinning. "Just you wait. We'll have a whole mess of fish for supper tonight." Thinking of fish sizzling in the frying pan, Daniel felt a stab of hunger. Johnny cake and berries were enough to keep you from starving, but they didn't fill you up the way fish or meat did. He longed for the stews they'd had those nights with Pa. Maybe he could figure a way of catching some small animals. But how? Without a gun or traps, it seemed impossible. Anyway, Pa would be back before long, and they'd be shooting game again. Will waded into the quiet pool. He peered into the water, his spear held ready. And as patiently as before, he waited. Daniel knew when Will saw fish. Will's whole body tightened. His wrist lifted ever so slightly, and then his spear stabbed into the water quick as lightning. No doubt about it, he'd gotten faster. But still he came up empty. Again and again, the slippery fish swam away too fast. Once Will was sure he had something. "Daniel!" he cried. "I got a big one!" Excitedly, he pulled up his spear, and then he looked down in disbelief. Stuck on the end was a large, soggy brown leaf. Disgusted, Will threw down his spear. Daniel picked it up. The point was broken. So it was useless to try to fish any more today. "Come on," he said. "We'll try again tomorrow." Well, that night, Will began working on a new fishing spear. You see, he was like Pa that way, Daniel thought. Once his mind was set on something, he'd never give up. He was like Pa in another way, too. Pa crafted most of his tools needed on the farm himself. Rakes and scoops and shovels, a plow, a wheelbarrow, even a sled. He seemed to know how to do it without anyone showing him how. Will must have been watching all those nights at home around the fire. His new spear was longer and heavier than the first one. After peeling off the bark, Will carefully shaved off every bump and rough edge till it was straight and smooth, and then he worked on the end. He sharpened it to a fine point and hardened the point by holding it over the fire's hot coals. It took 3 nights before Will was satisfied with his new spear. "It's going to work this time," he told Daniel. "I know it." The day was cloudy with the smell of rain. It began to drizzle in the early afternoon, and by the time the boys stopped work on the cabin, the woods were damp and gray. "Now is the best time for fishing," Will said excitedly, as they walked down the path they'd beaten down to the creek over the past few weeks. The trees leaned over them, heavy and mossy and dripping. On days like this, Daniel felt like they were crowding in even closer. A dense mist filled the spaces between them, and wet leaves reached out to brush his shirt, making him feel clammy all over. Will paid no attention to anything but his spear. At the creek, he tried it out again, making quick stabs into the shallow water. Daniel watched, sitting on a log that lay half in and half out of the water. "Feels pretty good," Will said. So he waded out and took his stance as before, the new spear held ready to strike. He stood that way a long time, like something rooted and growing there. And when Will finally moved, Daniel was startled. The spear darted down and came up. Empty again. But Will didn't seem discouraged. He moved a little way downstream, so Daniel followed, keeping an eye out for signs of clay on the muddy banks. He was poking a stick into a likely streak of grayish white when he heard splashing. "I got him!" cried Will. He held his spear high in triumph. A wriggling brown fish caught on the end of it. A trout, it looked like. A good-sized one, too. Big enough to fill both their bellies for supper tonight. Will's grin was so wide that Daniel couldn't help smiling himself. "You were right," he said. "The new spear did it." Encouraged by his success, Will wanted to keep fishing. But looking around him, Daniel saw that the gray mist was growing thicker. He could barely make out the trees on the other side of the creek. What if they couldn't find the path back to the cabin? They might get lost in the woods, and darkness would come soon. So he knew what Pa would say. "We better get back," he said, "before we can't see our way." They tramped upstream to the place where Will had started fishing. Daniel was relieved to see the little clump of ferns that he remembered, and the log half in and half out of the water. They hadn't lost the path. "Well, now that I've got the hang of it," Will said happily, "we'll have fish every night." He walked along, swinging the fish in one hand and the spear in the other. "Why, I wager when Pa and Ma get here, I can catch enough for a fish feast," he boasted. Ahead on the path, Daniel noticed some nuts. Chestnuts, it looked like. The first of those tasty red-brown nuts of the season. He stooped to pick them up. And above him he heard a sudden cracking sound. "Watch out!" cried Will. A tree limb came crashing down right at Daniel's feet. And looking up, he saw what had made it fall. A large black shape peered down at him. It had a thick head, a pointed snout, and long, sharp claws. And we'll stop right there. It's not the end of chapter 6, but I love to stop at the exciting parts, just to keep you coming back for tomorrow. We'll begin right there. Ooh, what a story this one is, too. So don't miss out. Well, you know what time it is. It's time for you to go and brush those teeth, wash your hands, wash your face, put on some clean pajamas, go and tell your parents you love them, and even your siblings, older and younger. And if you haven't picked up your toys on your bedroom floor, pick them up. And maybe put the dirty clothes in the dirty clothes hamper. You know, just to keep everything nice and tidy. Kind of like my room. See, there's nothing on the floor. You really can't see, I guess. There's nothing on the floor except for a carpet. Anyhow, all right. Good night, everybody. Hope to see you back tomorrow for another exciting adventure with Daniel and Will in Cabin on Trouble Creek. Stay tuned.